Hello and welcome to this Netacea webinar on retail under attack, how cyberfraud became big business. Today we're going to be looking at the size and the scope of the cyberfraud market, including some research from our threat research team, looking at the volume and the value of stolen assets being sold on digital marketplaces, but also looking at consumer sentiment towards that kind of behavior. I'm James Middleton, Director of Product Marketing here at Netacea. I'm going to introduce my colleague Cyril in just a moment, but first of all, just to give you a quick recap. So this is the third in our series of Retail Under Attack webinars. In the first one, if you've been following, we went into true crime fraud stories where we had another member of the threat intelligence team explaining the maturity we're seeing in terms of the cyber fraud ecosystem. And we also did a really deep dive into post-payment fraud techniques that we have gathered insights from in the communities that we've infiltrated. In the second episode, we stuck to the digital customer journey. So we looked at how retail fraud is carried out on websites at checkout. And we did a technical breakdown of how we see unsophisticated bot attacks and sophisticated bot attacks on different retail web estates. And we looked at the models that we use to detect malicious visitors on these websites. So today we're going to be diving a bit more into some research that we've gathered from Cyril's team and the threat research team, looking at the behaviors and the tactics and techniques used by organized cyber criminals. And we also have some insights that we got from a consumer survey we did into attitudes and perceptions of cyber fraud and how consumers feel about this. But before we launch into that, let me just give Cyril an opportunity to introduce himself. So Cyril, just give us a little bit of a flavor about what you get up to on the day-to-day.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jay. So I'm Cyril. I'm Principal Threat Researcher at Netacea. And my day is kind of split into two halves, really. Part of it is looking after our collection apparatus. So how do we track what these bad actors are doing on all the places that they frequent, whether that's marketplaces or the chats they're having with each other, or even some of the tools they're using and what that reports. And the other half is, diving into that and trying to come up with these really interesting insights so that we can protect our customers and help the industry really fight against cyber fraud.
Great, thanks. So the premise for today's webinar actually started from a conversation I did have with Cyril several months ago now. And Cyril was telling me that his team, the threat research team, had observed a number of influencers and promotions and advertisements for retail fraud behaviors disguised as refund hacks on a number of social media websites such as TikTok. And this is some examples. If you go to TikTok and you type in refund methods, then you get like a whole host of results. And coincidentally, I have a millennial daughter who was passing by my computer at the time, and she said, what are you doing? Because I'm familiar with some of those influencers and some of those adverts you've got up on your screen. And it turns out, the conversation, that indeed, millennials do get a lot of this stuff promoted to them. And it is a conversation among the millennial demographic in terms of their peer groups. And she did say that it's fairly tempting for people of that age group to actually get involved in some of this stuff and try out some of those refund hacks. I think you first started investigating this area in 2022, Cyril. So does that kind of represent what you saw in the market at the time?
I think actually it's quite a new thing that it's moved into social media, and it's actually been interesting to see that kind of evolution, because when we picked it up, this was back in 2022, and it was because there'd been a massive explosion of these adverts, but this was on your traditional kind of cybercrime forums, right? So it was being advertised or marketed to people who you expect to be more likely to commit fraudulent activities. And at that time, we'd seen like a 3-time increase in the number of adverts year on year. But the shift that we've seen recently, they've moved from, advertising to people who are frequenting cybercrime forums to advertising on social media to kind of a more mass market advertising. And it's partly due to the kind of consumer nature of this type of fraud, where these fraudsters actually need everyday people to use their service. So they started with kind of the criminally adjacent and those on the cybercrime forums, and as they needed more customers, they've moved to this social media. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see that evolution.
Thanks. So indeed, this conversation kind of got us thinking, and we decided to run a survey. So we surveyed 2,000 consumers across the US and the UK, a variety of age demographics. And indeed, we did find that social media is the leading source of information about these retail fraud techniques, and it's the way people find out about them. And that's true across all age groups. So social media is 58% across all age groups. Now, what was interesting is that news articles and TV reports is a close second. By 53% of people found out about retail fraud techniques through that method. But we did do a breakdown of this in the full research report, and I can send that to you after this webinar, and you can look into it. But this mainly applies to the middle-aged to older demographic, which makes sense. That's the demographic that still consumes a lot of their information through those mediums. But what was also interesting is that personal conversations between friends, family, and co-workers is also another big source of information. And I don't go into it in this webinar, but this is also in the survey write-up. Personal conversations is one of the biggest sources of proponents of actually using some of these refund hacks or retail fraud techniques as a way of generating a bit of additional income. And I think that kind of aligns with what I was hearing from the millennials and my own daughter's peer group. So just to sort of zero in on social media as the channel for distribution of this information, what you can see here is the findings of the survey on respondents who answered yes to have retail fraud guides or services being advertised or promoted to you on these social media channels. Now, this might not be surprising, but I think Facebook here is the big one, 19%, and then closely followed by TikTok, 16%, YouTube, 14%, and Instagram's in there somewhere. And of course, X or Twitter, all of the other sort of, I guess, more fringe social media channels. It's not quite up there yet, but all of the usual suspects you would expect, there is a lot of this activity on those channels.
I mean, I'm surprised you had 4% on LinkedIn there.
Well, LinkedIn is becoming, I think, more consumerized, really, certainly in my experience. So this was quite interesting. And I'm going to switch between findings from the Cyberfraud research, which was carried out by Cyril's team, and findings from the consumer survey we did, and give you a flavor, because I think there is kind of like an alignment here between what we're seeing on the criminal underground and what we're seeing in terms of consumer perception. So we did ask our consumers which of these fraud techniques they were aware of. And of course, did not arrive. DNA came out on top, which I guess makes sense. That's the one everybody thinks about. It's like, my package didn't arrive. Can I get a refund? What I found super interesting is that 16% of our consumers were familiar with the concept of boxers. And boxers are essentially third parties that will carry out the fraud on your behalf and sort of take the risk for a slice of the profit, of the value of that fraud. Is that, Cyril, is that a surprising number to you?
That is surprising, and it shows how this is permeated like culture, because it's one thing to know, oh yeah, if I get a package and say it didn't arrive, I can get a refund. But at the point that you're involved in boxes, there's complicity there. You're getting a third party to assist you with doing a fraud. That's not something that you can just think up on your own without really being involved, actually understanding about this fraud. So yeah, it's actually very surprising that it's that high.
So just to draw a sort of parallel here between that consumer sentiment and what we see the criminals talking about. So this chart on the right is the percentage of mentions of each of these methods that we tracked through many of the thousands of like forums and groups that we are present in. We've either infiltrated or joined somehow. The deep blue line there, that's the did not arrive channel. Again, that aligns with the most popular topic of conversation. But then the light blue turquoise line, that's the second most popular one. And this one's surprising because this is fake tracking ID. And this is more of a sophisticated kind of fraud technique. And Cyril, you can do a better job of explaining what FTID is than me.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this one was one of the ones that kind of came about at the same time that refund fraud was really blowing up. And it was popularized. There was this ebook that was doing the rounds by an anniversary called Bob, which really popularized this method. And the idea here is that you are trying to return a package, but you don't want people to actually receive the package. So if you go back to did not arrive, that's simple. The item didn't arrive, therefore I need a refund. I can't return it to you because I didn't get it. If the item did arrive and you're trying to get a refund, typically you need to return the package. So the idea was that if you could return the package to a location close enough to the actual fulfillment center, that the location tracker might say it's been delivered to the area, and that whoever receives it takes the package, takes its junk mail and throws it away. On the delivery tracking system, you've returned the package, and yet there's no package that you've actually had to return. And that means you don't actually have to return the item, you can return anything. So that's the general idea behind fake tracking ID. You just send some junk mail to an address near the location. Obviously, you need to do some editing of the labels and stuff to make that all work. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't want to kind of explain how to do it for people, but that's the general idea.
Okay, and we do actually dive into some of the other techniques you see here in the first episode of our Retail Under Attack webinar, which again, I will send you the link to. So the thing is that these promotions for retail fraud actually seem to be working because, as you can see here with findings from our consumer survey, 27%, more than a quarter of respondents have been tempted to actually participate in refund hacking. And 26%, a similar number, that's not on this chart, do actually believe that some amount of casual fraud is acceptable, like ethically. Now, again, we go into this in the report itself, but the majority, I think is 81%, draw the line about what is acceptable at denominations of less than $100. It seems that $100 is that kind of tipping point. That's when you get into serious fraud territory. But there were a further 8% that said that they do think over $500 worth of fraud was acceptable. So there are people willing to go bigger. And in fact, when we asked the question about whether you would be tempted to involve yourself in more serious fraud, 17% of total respondents said that they could be tempted to go from casual fraud to more serious fraud under certain circumstances. And I think what you can see here on the chart is that those certain circumstances are not really ethics or morals, because 38% would go ahead if they thought they just wouldn't get caught. So it's not a moral or an ethical question here. It's just whether they could get away with it question. And a similar number said that if the financial reward was significant enough, they would be tempted to involve themselves in more serious fraud. And I think this kind of speaks to what Cyril was saying earlier about how this is now permeating the consumer kind of consciousness. And then 21% would also be more tempted if they could see that others were doing it without consequence. And I think this is where that kind of those peer conversations come in. If you find out that your friends or co-workers or family members are doing something naughty and they're getting away with it, that's kind of the proof point you need that maybe you're going to get involved as well. This, for me, was, I think, the most interesting finding in the consumer survey research, because this kind of blew my mind. 18% of people that's of the total 2,000, claim to personally know someone who has participated in insider fraud, and 12% of those say yes within the retail, so within the brand itself, within the retailer. And 6% within the fulfillment chain. So we cover this in episode 1 as well. But these are people who work at the brand, at the retailer, or in the distribution process, and they use their access to the processes and systems they've got to enable fraud for others, third parties. Basically, they're kind of renting out their capabilities. Cyril, that number to me seems like staggeringly high, right?
I mean, this is even more shocking than the last number you had. Like the last number, I could kind of work out a way to say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. This is incredibly high, and the reason I say that is because one of the things we've found is that a lot of and when we're looking at the top organized crime groups, they would have maybe the one or two well-connected insiders that they are using. So the fact that so many people, this is nearly 1 in 5, right? The fact that so many people personally know, that's absolutely shock. Yeah, mind blowing. And I guess it depends on kind of what level of insider these are. When we're looking at the top groups, that insider is going to have a much higher level of access. They might actually be training up other insiders. We actually see some where they're trying to recruit insiders and kind of how they do that. But yeah, wow, 18%.
I think there's definitely scope here to do a bit more research, because frankly, we didn't ask any more questions on this area because I just didn't expect the response to be like this. But it certainly seems that it's worth us doing some more investigation into this area, because it feels like retailers have a big kind of exposure to this.
Yeah, I feel like, because this was all age groups. I think you said, and I feel like in some age groups, especially if you're thinking of like a university or college campus, that is more likely, because where you've got these communities, and if someone does it, everyone kind of knows, oh, that's the person that can get you that. But the fact, again, across and all age groups, yeah, crazy.
Yeah. So in our first episode, we did a bit of a focus on post-payment and refund fraud, and sort of what happened in the kind of human layer of the commercial process in retail. And then in the second episode, we looked at what happened in the digital customer journey, and that was more focused on checkout fraud. So today I thought to kind of round this out, we do a little bit more of a deeper dive into the fulfillment fraud part of this cyber fraud equation, I guess, or time methodology, and there is clearly money in it, and I think Cyril's team can attest to that, because why would people be involved in it given the risks? But on this slide here, we've got some excerpts of advertisements from various Telegram groups that Cyril's team has infiltrated and been tracking. And you can see people offering their scanning services. And for scanning services, that's the manipulation of like labels and things. You get prices ranging from $25 to $150, depending on the specific service that's been requested. And maybe even the carrier we're talking about as well, the fulfillment agent or courier. And I think some of these techniques we see, they're very like carrier specific, because obviously you get some retail brands that they have their own distribution and fulfillment operations, like Amazon. And then you get other retail brands that rely on third-party courier services like, UPS, or I'm in the UK, like Every or something like that. And I think some of the techniques are very specific to the carriers you want to try and the carriers you want to try and exploit. So, and then on the right-hand side, we've got an advert for someone selling their insider access to some of these systems that these fulfillment partners use. And in these cases, we see admin accounts traded for between $100 and $750. And I think in some cases, these insiders are using their credentials to create sub accounts, and then they're selling access to those accounts on the marketplaces for other third parties to make use of as well. And I think overall, when we're talking about the kind of cut that these enablers are taking, is between 30 and 35% of the value of any given fraud attempt. So if you're talking about like $1,000 laptop or an iPhone or something, that's a few $100s for a few minutes work, I guess. This stuff's over and done with pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially when they're scanning, right? A lot of the times what they're really doing there is they're changing a status. So, for example, they could be doing it once the package is being sent, before you actually receive it, they can mark it as return to sender. And then you get the package, but because it's marked as return to sender, they believe you've returned it, and then they don't get it, but they've got the proof you've returned it because it's being marked as that. So yeah, it is a small amount of work for them, but it's high risk for them, because obviously they're the ones who are more likely to get caught compared to, you think of the organized crime group, which is using their services, which is a bit more distant from the actual manipulation.
Yeah, and that's something we go into in both of our other webinars as well. In fact, is now so many components in this kind of cyber fraud ecosystem are now available as a service that any kind of wannabe criminal kingpin or have a go fraudster can just go on to various marketplaces and buy these as a service components and connect them all together and effectively build a kind of entire machine or automated system to carry out a not insignificant amount of fraud. The supply is already there. In many cases, it's just waiting for the demand. So, as I say, we did go into deep coverage of post-payment fraud methods like FTID and partially empty box, and DNA did not arrive in our previous webinar. But I wanted to give a bit more focus on the fulfillment part of this chain and some of the interesting insights we found here. And sometimes these are like organized fraudsters trying to get themselves into a position where they can leverage their access on behalf of third parties, and other times similar like vulnerabilities or business logic is being abused for other reasons, but it's still abuse of those processes. So I'm actually going to hand over to Cyril to talk through the 4 points here and these things that we're seeing specifically within the kind of fulfillment part of the distribution chain.
Yeah, so this is really about how valuable these accounts are, and as you mentioned, James, there's a number of reasons why people might want these accounts, and might be just someone who is looking for an income, looking to work. I was going to say legitimate. I decided not to say that because we're still talking about fraud here, but someone who's looking to work who might not have the right documents, whether that's citizenship, whether that's a driver license or any other documentation. And so they are fraudulently creating an account, and we've called this fraudulent document acquisition. This could be, creating stuff. LLMs are getting quite good at mimicking documentation. But a lot of time that is either used in conjunction with, or actually it's not even used at all. And what people are actually using are real documents from people. So it's really a very identity fraud heavy situations where people who have access to people's driving license might just take a photo of it, whether that's someone working in a car dealership where they take a scan of your driving license to let you have a test drive, and actually they're selling those. On the dark web, we see for a driver license front back scan is around $20 on the dark web, right? So you've got this fraudulent document acquisition, which again could be used by people who just want income and they need a way to get the documents, but also anyone who wants to commit fraud and needs to get access as an insider. Well, that's another reach for them to use as well. So they can go to these, and again, as you said earlier about kind of fraud as a service, they might do this themselves. They might actually go to a third party who can supply this documentation for them and get access. And once they've got access, they can do they need to get orders, right? And again, if we're taking the first people who just want a job, they probably just want the most valuable order. If 10 orders are coming a day in your facility and there's 5 of you working, and if you get the 2 most valuable ones, you'll make a lot more money than if you get the 2 least valuable ones, right? But if you're the fraudster, you don't really care about the value of the packages. What you care about is the package that you have been tasked with making disappear, or whatever part of the refund fraud chain you're responsible for. You need to get access to that package. So how can you do that? How can you make sure that when the packages come, you're the very first person to be able to select what you want and get access to that? So that's kind of your order manipulation. And with that, using bots means you can be quicker to react. And that's really important. You can't let someone else get that consignment before you, because then you can't fulfill your part, and that's lost money for you. And whether you are just looking for a job or you're actively using this to commit further fraud, there's a chance that your account might be deactivated. And if fraudsters quit every time they reach a hurdle, there will be very little fraud in the world. But this is income for them, and nobody likes having less income, so they're going to try and get reactivated. Now, in some cases, actually, it's a permanent deactivation, and where they've actually been banned, and they might have to go through kind of point one again and get more documents and create a whole new identity and start again. But in some cases, they can just get their account activated. And then the fourth point here, this is really fits into both kind of 1 and 3 in terms of these systems aren't very easy to just to join, right? There's checks and balances that are in place, but as with anything in the kind of fraud world, checks and balances are made for fraudsters to circumvent. Again, if they couldn't be circumvented, there'll be very little fraud in the world. And facial recognition is a great example of this, because a lot of places ask you to supply a video. And, in previous years, that might have been quite hard to fake, but especially with generative AI these days, what a lot of fraudsters can do is send a picture of themselves to the service they're using, and they can superimpose that onto an image, like a deep fake, and they can supply an image of them, or a video of them saying whatever they have to say to pass that verification check. So, all of these kind of tie into each other, but it's one of these services that I think was started for kind of, again, it's still fraud, but it's fraud targeting kind of very different demographic, which other fraudsters who are now looking to get inside access can use. And it goes back to what you said, James, around kind of just everything's there as a service. Doesn't matter if you are not the original intendee of that service, because people are offering that service, you can use that for whatever goals you want.
Thanks. And to echo Cyril's point, in I think episode 1 of this series, we have a great anecdote from another member of Cyril's team about one of our threat researchers and their process of infiltrating an organized fraud group, and the kind of the tasks they were given, and the fact that they were sort of kept. They had to work in kind of like a cell where they didn't, a virtual cell, not a physical cell, a cell where they didn't know who was giving them their orders and who their kind of colleagues were, but they were effectively tasked with a volume of fraud they had to commit every day, and the tools they had to use and the targets they had to go after. And to Cyril's point, if fraudsters gave up after they encountered any of these hurdles, there would be very little fraud. It's like that's your literal job as a fraudster, is to find ways of overcoming these hurdles and make sure you hit your quota. Because if you don't hit your quota, then you effectively get put on the criminal performance plan. And it is super interesting. We're not going to go into it today, but that was in episode 1 of this series. So do check that out. So we focused on how the consumer sentiment aligns with the cyber fraud underground findings. And I did say at the start of this webinar that this webinar is about the business of cyber fraud, and I wanted to give you some more numbers. So we actually track around 2,000 digital marketplaces frequented by fraudsters, where they buy and sell things like how-to guides for different retailers and different fulfillment providers. but they're mostly trading in stolen accounts. So that's like access to all of those digital services people use, and also stolen gift cards and things like that, or accounts that have loyalty points attached to them. And what was super interesting, like over the 12 months from the start of 2024 to the start of 2025, is that we saw the number of individual sellers on these marketplaces increase from just over 1,700 to a 12-month high of 2,700 just over those 12 months. And what was also interesting is that the fraud ecosystem very much follows the same trends, seasonal trends as retail. And you see like the ebbs and flows that you would also see in retail, but everything kind of climbs to this peak in terms of the number of products available for sale during the holiday season. So you get that high in December. And in December of 2024, the number of product listings on these marketplaces we tracked hit a high of almost 50,000. But on any given day throughout the year, the average was around 20,000 product listings. It is very difficult to say what the total value of stolen goods available was, because some of these listings are just for like a handful of accounts, 3 accounts, 10 accounts, whatever. And others are for an unlimited number of stolen accounts. And that might be bravado on behalf of the fraudster, trying to claim that they've got unlimited access. But it could very much be that some of these organized fraud groups have found a repeatable way of stealing accounts, and they can effectively steal them to order. So to my point earlier, there is demand, that there is supply in existence, which is really just waiting for that demand to pick up. And if you're a retail brand watching this, your accounts may well be on those marketplaces. In terms of the valuation of things, we did track the selling price of stolen accounts. And what was interesting is that these stolen accounts, they never sell for more than 40% of face value. And this chart is very nice and level throughout the course of the year. And again, interestingly, you get that little bump in December when stolen accounts were selling for like 20% of face value. And maybe this was just fraudsters trying to clear a backlog of inventory or something, or maybe they wanted to get a little more revenue in the holiday period, so they could buy their fraud friends and family some additional treats. But this is the kind of the trading value of stolen accounts that we see. And this was interesting in terms of trying to attach value to things, is the staggering rise in the value of stolen gift cards available. So in February of 2025, this year, there was a total of around $16 million worth of stolen gift cards available. So that's gift cards specifically. Not other accounts with any kind of value attached. And that's a 500% rise year on year, from 2.3 million at the start of the year to 9.2 million in December, and then that jump again at the start of 2025. That kind of blows my mind as well. What's interesting is that these numbers also align with trends that we see in retail as well. And gift cards have kind of been growing in adoption amongst consumers. And I think I saw some research that US consumers spend around 50% of their gift budget, their present budget, on gift cards now, because it's a more acceptable way of gifting cash to their friends and family. And I think the trend is that gift cards are becoming more desirable for consumers, because sadly, consumers are actually using these gift cards to pay for essentials like groceries and gas, whereas years ago they would probably have been using them as a little treat for themselves to get like a gift or a present or some luxury item around the holiday period. But this is now a more convenient and desirable way of transferring cash to your friends and family, so that people can just afford to buy the necessities. But the the point here is that as more and more value is transferred into gift cards than ever before, this really, really makes that a target for cyber criminals. And I think that's what this chart speaks to, is that's what we are actually seeing on the criminal underground. So to close, and I think around about now, one of my colleagues will be doing some digital wizardry, and a button should be appearing on your screen. But as with all of our webinars, we like to have an offer for the audience, and what we're offering this time is a bespoke version of the reports I've been talking about that will identify some of the techniques that we see that are most applicable to your business and your brand, and some of the most relevant findings that will also be most applicable to your brand. And we will also use some of the threat intelligence capacity from Cyril's team to identify whether we are detecting any chatter about your brand on some of these criminal forums. And we'll send that to you as a PDF that you can share with your stakeholders. And if you'd like to have a conversation about those findings, we'd love to talk to you. So if you're interested in that offer, can you hit the button you see on your screen right about now? We will also follow up with more information about that in the emails after this webinar. And if you're watching it online, you will also get the opportunity to request that offer by way of responding to an email as well. So just to close out this webinar, thanks for your attention. Cyber fraud is already a big business, that much is clear, and it's very, very well organized and becoming even more organized. Now, a few months ago, when I was working on the cyber fraud in research in retail report, I wrote that fraud is seen as a victimless crime because it's something that's just absorbed by the kind of, the faceless brands. But I actually think it's much worse than that now, because there is clearly an understanding of the impact of fraud and the fact that it's not a victimless crime because it does impact the brands and it does impact other consumers. And inevitably, the costs will be transferred down to the consumers. So there is clearly like an understanding of the ethics and the morals at play here. And it's kind of whether people care about these things. And I think it's clear that the size of the market itself is massive. If we just look at some of the operations that have been carried out by the authorities and law enforcement. So at the start of this year, there was something called Operation Talent that happened when a number of very, very high-profile underground marketplaces, Selix, Cracked, and Nold, were taken down, affecting more than 10 million users in total, which is a staggering number. And then last year, in 2024, there was a place called Breach Forums that was taken down. And that forum alone had 250,000 members. So Cyril's team spend a lot of their time infiltrating those communities, but also much more closed communities as well. And I think it's fair to say that the numbers of participants, and I mean both like the organized criminals as well as these kind of casual, have-a-go fraudsters, the numbers are probably in the millions globally, right? This is a very, very large ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing that shows that the most is your stat that you had, right? Nearly 1 in 5 people who you surveyed says they knew an insider. And that's just the insiders, right? If you think this ecosystem is way bigger than just the insiders, you've got the whether it's the boxers or the administrators of the groups, and just people. I mean, a lot of people who used to commit refund fraud themselves have stopped doing that, and they just sell methods now because that's lower risk to them than actually doing it themselves. So there's a wide ecosystem, and millions, and it's not surprising at all that. That's the least surprising thing you said so far.
I think it's the complexity and the organization of this ecosystem, right? It's now, as I said, it's now possible to put together your own fraud operation from components that are delivered as a service by third parties. And what that means is that as the fraudsters are able to kind of fragment what they're doing, it also sort of fragments the risk as well, because you just become responsible for like a link in the chain rather than having to take on the entirety of the risk of carrying out an end-to-end fraud operation yourself. So that creates these problems, I guess, for authorities and law enforcement, and of course for our retailers that are watching this, and that somewhere that Netacea and Cyril's team and what we do in the digital sphere can really help. So I'd like to thank everybody for your attention here. Cyril, thanks very much for joining me today. Really, really insightful. As I said, this webinar was all about the findings from our Cyberfraud in Retail research report, which I will add the link to in the emails we will send you. And I will also send you a link to the full write-up of the Cyberfraud economy survey findings, so you can learn more about how your potential customers feel about fraud in general. And if you are interested in that offer, then please accept, and we will see what we can do about generating a bespoke report that gives you some useful and actionable insights that might be relevant to your retail brand as well. Thanks very much for joining me. See you next time.